Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The soil on Verath-Soa had opinions. Joel Raines had arrived at this conclusion on his 9th day on the planet, when the moisture retention data from Field Sector 3 returned readings that contradicted themselves across a 4-hour window, not because the instruments were malfunctioning, but because the soil had apparently redistributed its own composition between measurements. His field assistant, a young Vithari man named Drevitt, who approached everything Joel said with the careful diplomacy of someone translating between two languages that shared no root words, explained that the ground in this region was threaded through with mycological networks that responded to atmospheric pressure changes by shifting mineral content laterally. Joel had asked whether this was widely known. Drevitt said yes. It was considered basic knowledge. Joel had nodded, written it in his field log as though he had suspected this all along, and spent the following evening staring at the ceiling of his module, reconsidering his professional credentials. This was the context in which he worked. Verath-Soa was a colony world in the outer tier of the Vithari settlement network, selected for agricultural expansion because of its abundant arable landmass and its relatively manageable atmospheric chemistry, manageable being. Joel had come to understand, a diplomatic word that meant livable for humans if they wore filtration supplements during the third light cycle and didn't make any sudden movements around the pollinating season of the ground flower species that the colonists called Velath, and which produced a spore cloud that smelled exactly like burnt coffee and caused temporary chromatic distortion in human vision. Joel had experienced this once. He had filed a report describing the experience as a visual anomaly consistent with minor atmospheric exposure, and had not mentioned that for approximately 40 minutes the sky had appeared to be breathing. The planet ran on a cycle of 3 distinct light periods rather than the binary rhythm of Earth's day and night. The first cycle was a cool, silver-gray morning that lasted roughly 4 hours and felt like the universe was still deciding whether to commit to the day. The second was the long amber stretch of full light, warm and thick, during which the colony did most of its outdoor work, and the crops did whatever it was they were doing with their sideways root systems in defiance of every agricultural model Joel had studied. The third cycle was a deep blue-violet dusk that lasted 2 hours, and which Joel privately considered the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and had mentioned to no one because he was a professional. His posting was officially designated Agricultural Integration Technician, Grade 2, which meant he was responsible for adapting Earth-origin farming methodologies to local soil and climate conditions, coordinating resource distribution with settlement administration, and submitting monthly reports to the Colonial Agriculture Bureau on Verath-Soa's production capacity. It was precise, necessary work, and Joel was genuinely good at it, in the way that a person becomes genuinely good at something when they stop expecting it to behave like the version of itself they studied and start paying attention to what it actually does. He had recalibrated 3 irrigation systems, redesigned 2 drainage networks, and successfully argued the Bureau into approving a hybrid planting model that combined Earth rotation schedules with the Vithari geometric arrangement methods, which had increased yield in 2 test sectors by 9%. He was 34 years old, from a small town in the Appalachian foothills of Ohio, and he had been off-world for 6 years across 3 postings, and he was still not entirely used to moons. Verath-Soa had 2, both visible during the third cycle, one large and pale and the other small and dark and slightly too fast, as though it was running late for something. He met the settlement administrator on a morning in his 3rd week, in the coordination hall at the eastern edge of Block 7. He had been awake since the first cycle, had calf residue on his collar, and was carrying a data tablet loaded with yield projections that he had not yet had time to finish reading. She was already there when he arrived, standing at the central data table, reviewing a holographic spread of the same projections, and his brain did what human brains do when confronted with something simultaneously familiar and entirely other. It reached for the nearest available category, said woman, mid-30s, and then stood very still while the details quietly contradicted it. Her name was Sale. She told him the projections were 11% below colony requirement and that she expected preliminary soil variance data from his department before the end of the current light cycle. Then she asked him, with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, whether Earth agricultural systems also struggled with interference from non-native mycological networks, or whether that was a specific condition of Verath-Soa. Joel told her he wasn't certain, but it was an excellent question, and he intended to find out. She looked at him with the particular steadiness of someone who is accustomed to receiving confident wrong answers and finds the alternative noteworthy. She said she appreciated that. He thought about that sentence for the rest of the day. He also submitted the soil variance data with 40 minutes to spare, which he was aware proved very little, and which he was aware he was pleased about anyway. The meetings had a logic to them that Joel only recognized the way you recognize a slow leak, not when it starts, but sometime after the damage is already interesting. Each one arrived with a perfectly reasonable justification. A water table anomaly in the eastern sectors. A discrepancy in the seed distribution manifests for the upcoming planting rotation. A question about whether the earth-origin legume varieties could tolerate the mineral shift that occurred every 40 days when Verath-Soa's larger moon reached its closest orbital pass and did something peculiar to the electromagnetic field that the colonists treated as a minor inconvenience, and which had, on one occasion, caused every compass Joel owned to simultaneously point at a storage shed containing nothing more magnetically significant than a crate of canned proteins. These were real issues. They required genuine coordination. Joel was not inventing reasons to be in the coordination hall, and neither, as far as he could observe, was Sale. And yet the meetings consistently ran past their scheduled endpoints by margins that could not be fully accounted for by the complexity of the agenda, arriving at natural conclusions, and then continuing, the way a conversation continues when neither person is quite ready for it to be over, and both people are pretending not to notice that. He cataloged this the way he cataloged soil data methodically, without immediate interpretation, waiting for the pattern to declare itself. What declared itself, over the course of the second month, was that Sale remembered things. Not the operational details of their working relationship, which she would have been expected to retain as a matter of administrative competence, but the peripheral things, the offhand comments, the 4-second digressions. He had mentioned once, while explaining an amendment process, that a particular soil layering technique reminded him of something his grandmother had done in her kitchen garden in Ohio. And 3 weeks later, describing a traditional Vithari planting method, she had said it might be the closest equivalent to what he'd described. And she had watched his face when she said it with the precise quality of attention that suggested she had been holding the connection ready, waiting for the right moment to offer it. Joel had found this simultaneously touching and slightly alarming, in the way that discovering someone has been paying close attention to you can be both things at once. He mentioned none of this to anyone. He wrote his monthly reports with the focused innocence of a man who had not noticed anything and was very committed to this position. What he did do was ask questions, carefully, laterally, the way you approach a territorial animal, not directly, not with declarations of intent, but through the patient accumulation of adjacent information. His primary resource was Porath, the supply chain logistics coordinator, who was broadly the most cheerful person Joel had encountered on any world, and who seemed to regard humans as an ongoing source of wholesome entertainment. Porath stood a full head taller than Joel, had 4 fingers on each hand, and possessed the quality of someone who has decided that frankness is not rude, but is in fact a form of respect. and who finds the human preference for indirection both mystifying and deeply funny. He had once watched Joel spend 6 minutes carefully phrasing a question about a shipping schedule, and then told him that he could simply ask what he wanted to know, and that Vithari people did not generally infer aggression from direct inquiry. And Joel had thanked him, and then immediately phrased his next question with equal indirection out of sheer habit. It was through Porath, deployed with as much casualness as Joel could manufacture, that the architecture of Vithari partnership structures became clear. The compatibility assessments, the family councils, the algorithms refined over 4 millennia of accumulated genetic and social data. Porath explained all of it with the generous thoroughness of a man who enjoys explaining things and has found a willing audience, using the word cultivation in a way that made Joel, an agricultural technician, feel that the universe had a moderately cruel sense of humor. The Vithari did not believe that personal feeling was irrelevant to partnership. They believed it was a result of correct pairing rather than a precondition for it. Feeling followed alignment. To reverse the sequence, to choose first and align second, was to privilege one data point over thousands of years of evidence. The word for this carried the weight of selfishness, and, in certain legal contexts, something closer to theft, because genetic potential was communal property, and redirecting it for personal reasons was understood as taking something that did not entirely belong to you. Joel repeated the word theft with the careful tone of someone confirming they have heard correctly. Porath said yes, and then asked whether Joel had resolved the recurrence in the Field Sector 9 drainage system, because it was showing variance again on the infrastructure monitors. Joel said he would look into it. He drove back to Block 7 through the amber light of the second cycle, past the fields where the crops were doing their sideways growing with their customary indifference to his agricultural training, and thought about the word theft for a long time. The second moon was visible on the horizon even in daylight, small and quick and slightly frantic, and he watched it for a moment and thought that he understood, dimly, how something could move faster than was entirely sensible and still not arrive anywhere it intended. He filed a maintenance request for the Field Sector 9 drainage system. He did not file anything else. The name arrived the way unwelcome information tends to arrive, casually, embedded in a sentence about something else entirely, delivered by someone who either didn't know it would land heavily or knew precisely, and had decided that was acceptable. Porath mentioned it on a Tuesday, which on Verath-Soa meant the long amber second cycle of the 14th day of the planting month, while he and Joel were standing in a supply depot, reviewing an inventory discrepancy involving 40 units of soil amendment compound that had been logged as received, and then failed to materialize in any of the storage facilities they were supposed to occupy. The compound was eventually located in a secondary depot 2 sectors over, misfiled under a classification code that Porath said was used exclusively for ceremonial mineral powders, which meant the compounds had been sitting in a storage room beside a quantity of ritual dust, while Joel's amendment schedule ran 3 days behind. Joel had taken this with the particular brand of patience he had developed over 6 years of off-world postings, which was the patience of a man who has learned that the universe finds logistical misunderstandings funny, and has decided to find this funny also, even when it isn't. It was while they were arranging the reclassification that Porath mentioned, with the same informative energy he brought to shipping schedules and moisture data, that Sale's family had contracted her to a match with a lineage from the northern settlements. The family name was Sorval. The match himself was called Kavith. His genetic profile complemented Sale's across 14 compatibility indices, which Porath described with the mild pride of someone recounting a good harvest. And the families had been in formal negotiation for years, not over whether it would happen, that had been established early, but over the precise terms of the political alliance the marriage would formalize. Because in Vithari society, a partnership between prominent lineages was also an instrument of governance, and instruments of governance required careful tuning. Joel asked how Sale felt about it, with the kind of studied neutrality that he was increasingly aware was not fooling Poreth and possibly not fooling anyone. Poreth said that this was a very human question. He said it kindly. Joel said he understood, and then immediately demonstrated that he did not entirely understand by asking a follow-up question about whether there was any provision in Vithari law for compatibility assessments that returned unexpected results after the contract was established. Poreth looked at him for a long moment with the serene patience of a man watching a friend walk toward a conclusion that the friend would reach in their own time, and that he had no intention of shortcutting. He said that unexpected results within a finalized contract were addressed through a supplementary council review process that generally took 2 to 3 years and almost never produced a different outcome. Joel thanked him. Poreth told him the amendment compound needed to be transferred before the end of the cycle, or it would be reclassified again automatically by the depot's sorting system, which had opinions about where things belonged and was not interested in appeals. The coordination meeting that week was on a morning during the first silver cycle, which meant the light was cool and tentative, and the fields outside the coordination hall windows were the particular shade of gray-green that Verath-Soa produced in the hours before it committed to the day. Sale was reviewing water allocation projections when Joel arrived, and she had the expression he had catalogued over 2 months of observation as her working face, precise, slightly ahead of itself, thinking about the next thing while addressing the current one. She acknowledged him with a nod and asked whether he had resolved the eastern sector drainage before he had fully sat down, which was also characteristic, and which he had stopped finding abrupt and started finding efficient in the specific way that another person's habits become comfortable before you've consciously decided to be comfortable with them. They worked through the agenda. There was a question about the planting rotation schedule that required revision because of a projected mineral shift in the 40th day lunar cycle, and Joel had come with 3 alternative models, which seemed to please her in the minimal way that preparedness pleased her, not with enthusiasm, but with a slight settling, a reduction in the forward lean of her attention. There was a resource allocation conflict between his field team's irrigation work and a scheduled infrastructure survey, which they resolved in 11 minutes through a sequencing adjustment that was obvious in retrospect, and which Joel was privately pleased he had thought of first. And then there was a report his team had filed about a cluster of marker stones in the southern quadrant of Field Sector 6 that had been briefly relocated to clear space for a drainage channel, which Joel introduced into the meeting with the careful tone of a man presenting evidence that is not entirely in his favor. Sale reviewed the report. Then she looked up at him and said that the stones marked the boundary of a harvest ceremony site that her community had used for 6 generations, and that their arrangement encoded a specific geometric relationship to the larger moon's orbital alignment that the ceremony required to function correctly. She paused. She said that they could be restored without permanent consequence since the meaning resided in the arrangement rather than the location, and that she would send his team a complete map of culturally significant site arrangements in the settlement area. Another pause. She said she would annotate it clearly and would specifically flag the ones that also constituted navigational obstructions as a practical courtesy. Joel said he would have his team formally apologize to each stone in sequence, starting with the ones that appeared most load-bearing. The luminescent patterns along her jaw brightened briefly, a quick shift in the network of lines across her cheekbones, there for a moment, and then brought back to stillness with the controlled deliberateness of someone closing a door they'd opened by accident. She looked at the water allocation projections and asked him about the eastern sector variance. He answered. The meeting ran long. Afterward, walking back through the mineral composite corridor with its persistent half-cinnamon scent, Joel counted, without particularly wanting to, the number of forces arranged in a single direction. A contracted match, a political alliance, years of family negotiation, legal liability structured as communal debt, an entire civilization's worth of evidence that personal feeling was downstream of correct data, not the other way around. He laid these against the other column, the one that was harder to quantify but had been accruing entries for 2 months without his permission, and stood in the corridor for a moment longer than was necessary, looking at nothing in particular. Then he went back to his module and revised the planting rotation model for the 40th day lunar cycle, because the work was real and the soil still had opinions, and both of those things were, at minimum, things he knew how to address. She came on an evening in the 3rd month, during the long amber stretch of the 2nd cycle, when the settlement had gone quiet in the way it did when the work was finished, and the 2 moons were doing their nightly negotiation on the horizon. The large one patient and pale, the small one moving with its characteristic urgency, as though it had somewhere to be and was annoyed about the distance. Joel had been reviewing soil variance reports with the focused attention of a man who was absolutely reading soil variance reports, and not at all sitting in his module thinking about the same set of facts he had been rearranging for 6 weeks. He had become, in his own private assessment, extremely good at the performance of professional absorption. He had soil data open on 3 separate screens. He had made notes. He was a man with no inner life beyond mycological network interference patterns, and he had committed to this fully. When the knock came, he stood up, knocked his knee against the data table, said something brief and sincere about the experience of pain, and opened the door expecting Porath with another chapter of his cultural education series. Perhaps something on inheritance law or the spiritual significance of the 40th day lunar cycle, delivered with the cheerful relentlessness of a man who has decided that information is a gift and that Joel should be grateful. Sale was standing in the corridor. He said her name. It was not his best sentence. She said, "I have chosen you." She said it the way she reviewed yield projections precisely, having already done the calculation, presenting the result rather than the working. She said she wanted him to understand that she had conducted this accounting completely and without shortcuts, and that every force arranged against this choice had been real and fully entered into the ledger. Her position, her family designation, the contract her family had negotiated across years with the Sorval lineage, the legal liability that her civilization classified in the same category as communal theft because her genetic potential was not considered entirely her own. She had put all of it on one side of the calculation, she said, and she had put him on the other side, and the ledger had returned its result. Joel stood in his doorway on a colony world where the soil had opinions, and the sky breathed during pollinating season, and the smaller moon was always running late, and absorbed the fact that the most precisely delivered confession he had ever received had just been made to him by a woman who had endangered her entire life to make it, and that he was responsible in some measure for whatever happened next. He said, "I need to make sure I understand the accounting, because what you're describing isn't a debt I can repay. You're not choosing this because I've earned it. You're choosing it because you've decided it's worth it to you, and those are different things, and I need to know that you know that." She looked at him. The luminescent patterns across her jaw were moving, not the brief flicker he had catalogued over 3 months of meetings, the one that appeared and was swiftly controlled, but something slower and more sustained, the full network of lines across her cheekbones illuminated in a way he had never seen before, complex and unhurried, like a system that had stopped pretending to be idle. She said, "Yes, that is also part of why." He stepped back from the door. He said he thought she should come in and that he had no clear idea what came next, but he was confident that the corridor was not the correct venue for any of it. He also said that if Porath was somewhere nearby watching this happen, he would like it noted for the record that he had handled it with reasonable composure given the circumstances. She came in. She looked briefly at the 3 screens of soil variance data and then at him, and said that he had been reading mycological network reports at this hour, which was not a question. He said he found them very calming. She said that this was the most human thing she had ever heard. He made 2 cups of calf on the module's narrow kitchen unit, which had been manufactured for Earth-standard use, and which he had always found disproportionately comforting in the alien geometry of the room. He set one in front of her. She looked at it with the expression of someone examining an unfamiliar instrument, and then drank from it with the careful commitment of a person who has decided to accept a new thing fully and without complaint. She said it tasted like the Verath-Soa season. He said most people from Earth felt that way too, initially. She said she thought she could learn to find it acceptable. He thought, but did not say, that this seemed like a reasonable template for what they were doing. They talked through most of the amber cycle and into the beginning of the blue-violet dusk, which came through the module's narrow window and filled the room with the light that Joel had always considered the most beautiful thing on the planet and had never told anyone about. He told her now. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that her people called this hour the settling, because it was when the day's data was considered complete. He thought that was either very beautiful or very Vithari, and was probably both. What they did not do was solve anything. There was no solution available that evening. There were only the concrete facts of what she had done and what it would cost her, and the equally concrete fact that he intended, with the full weight of whatever he was, to be worth it, not as a repayment, because she had been clear about that and he had listened, but as the natural consequence of being seen completely by someone and deciding to become, going forward, exactly the person they had seen. He was an agricultural technician from Ohio who had spent 6 years learning to work with systems that didn't behave the way his training said they should, and he understood, perhaps better than most, that the correct response to a living system was not to impose your model on it, but to pay attention until the system told you what it needed. Outside, the small moon completed another of its anxious orbits. The soil in Field Sector 9 was probably developing another drainage variance. Somewhere in a storage depot, ceremonial mineral powder sat beside agricultural compound in cheerful misfiled proximity, and Poreth was almost certainly going to mention the drainage issue in the morning with the same pleasant tone he used for everything. And the Velith would bloom again in 40 days, and turn the sky briefly incomprehensible. Joel looked across the narrow table at a woman who had handed him the most honest thing anyone had ever offered him, and thought that honesty of that weight required honesty in return. So he told her that he was aware he was not a compatibility index. He was not an algorithm. He could not promise optimal outcomes or cross-reference himself against 4,000 years of genetic data. What he could promise was that he would argue with her when she was wrong, remember what mattered to her, and always tell her when he didn't know something rather than generating confident answers he hadn't earned. She considered this for a moment with the full attention of both rings of her irises. Then she said that on the basis of available evidence, she found this assessment credible. She said it in the tone she used for yield projections she trusted. He said he would take it. Outside, the settling deepened into full dusk. Inside, nothing was resolved and everything was decided, which Joel had come to understand, after 6 years of working with systems that had opinions, was often how the most important things began.